Okay, my next topic for discussion is the Zapruder film. This is stage 3 of what I call the deception. We're talking about deceit and deception in the evidence, and this is my third category of deception. Now, I'll preface all of these statements about the film by simply saying that, as you may know, the Zapruder film copyright is currently held by the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas. And if we had wanted to use Zapruder film images in this portion of my presentation, we would have had to seek commercial licensing, and we would have had to pay a licensing fee. That was beyond the scope of this project, so we're going to have a discussion. So we're going to have a discussion about the Zapruder film that addresses, for the most part, chain of custody problems with the film, The Weekend of the Assassination. Where I talk about changes to image content in the film, I will occasionally reference 1 or 2 key frame numbers which you can easily access in another venue. You can go to your computer search engine and put in Zapruder film and you'll receive many sources of imagery. The one source that I know will assist you in digesting this part of my presentation is the DVD called Image of an Assassination. It was commissioned and paid for by the Zapruder family before they turned over the copyright to the film to the 6th Floor Museum. So in 1998, this DVD, Image of an Assassination, was released. It's still for sale, and it consists of first-generation images made from the extant film in the archives by the LMH company, the Zapruder family, in 1997. The DVD was sold a year later. They took first-generation copies of each frame, digitized them, and then reassembled them as a motion picture. So this tool is one way where you can easily access any specific frame numbers that I might mention. Now, the images in that DVD, many of them are subject to a high contrast buildup. The contrast has been played with, and many of them are a bit darker than perhaps they should be, and some of the color has been brightened up, and so that it's not an exact copy of what's in the archives, but for our purposes, for the purposes of this discussion, that is one of the many tools you could use to access any frame numbers that I refer to in this presentation. So let's move on now and talk about the Z film. Now, I've concluded that the famous Zapruder home movie appears to be an altered film, not the authentic out-of-camera original. The Zapruder film is admittedly the hottest topic within the JFK research community, so you are going to get my own personal conclusions about the status of this film based on my 3 years of work with the Assassination Records Review Board, where I was the point person for all Zapruder film matters, and based on additional study that I've conducted during the decade following the shutdown of the review board. So without any further ado, these are the things about the film that I believe have been altered. The true exit wound in the right rear of the head has been crudely blacked out. I would encourage anyone who has access to the film to look at frame 317. And the large head wound seen in the right front and top of the head may be nothing but artwork. In fact, it has to be artwork because it's entirely inconsistent with the wound seen at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Now, we've been discussing the wound seen at Parkland Hospital, and in fact, the wound seen right after President Kennedy arrived at Bethesda by many people. And none of those people described any damage to the top of the head or to the right side of the head, forward of the right ear. And yet in the Zapruder film, that's the only damage you see. You see the right rear of the head blacked out. In fact, the entire rear of the head blacked out, severely blacked out, with darkness that's almost D-max, it's so dark. And you see a massive wound on the top of the head and a large wound on the right side of the head, which look very, very similar, but not exactly the same as the autopsy photographs we've been looking at. Now, here are some other indicators of the film's likely alteration. Abraham Zapruder and his secretary, Marilyn Sitzman, who was standing with him on the pergola, both claimed that he started filming the motorcade before the car turned the corner from Houston to Elm Street. They both have said that. Both said that for years before they passed away. They were consistent with each other. You don't see the turn of the limousine from Houston to Elm in the existing film. The exit debris seen traveling to the left rear of JFK's head by numerous Dealey Plaza eyewitnesses is not seen in the existing film. Some of the people that have described this quite vividly, Dealey Plaza witnesses, are the Willis family in the Men Who Killed Kennedy series, Charles Brem and Mark Lane's film Rush to Judgment, B.J. Hargis, one of the motorcycle policemen to the left rear of the limousine in numerous interviews, and Beverly Oliver. And I might add, there were two Dallas County surveyors, Mr. Brenneman and West, who were commissioned by Life magazine very shortly after the assassination to make a plat map, an accurate plat map, a surveyor's map of Dealey Plaza and what happened during the assassination using blow-up frames from the Zapruder film. They were told these are blow-up frames from Mr. Zapruder's film. So they had access shortly after the assassination to 8x10 glossy prints, at least 4 or 5 of which they recalled years later showed exit debris leaving the president's head and traveling toward the left rear. This recollection of theirs is consistent with motorcycle outriders Hargis and Marshall being hit in the face, in the visor, all over their uniforms with debris to the left rear of the limousine. It's entirely consistent with that. Now, those gentlemen are deceased now, those two surveyors, but they gave newspaper interviews in the 1970s. Their comments are on record, and they're credible in the sense that they're describing the type of debris and the direction of travel consistent with all the Dealey Plaza eyewitnesses who talk about it. Now, the rapid motion of JFK's body back and to the left in the Zapruder film, the so-called head snap, interestingly enough, was not described by Dealey Plaza eyewitnesses. A lot of people have never thought about this. We're so used to watching the Zapruder film and seeing the back and to the left motion of the president during the shooting, and we're so used to equating that with shots from the right front that we assume that all the people in Dealey Plaza saw this. None of the Dealey Plaza eyewitnesses that I know of, and I've studied this case for over 3 decades, none of them described such a rapid motion to the left and to the rear by the president. In fact, some of them described the head going forward. So, many other researchers and I now agree that if the exit debris frames traveling to the left of the head were removed through optical excision, in other words, if a new Zapruder film was made with an optical printer which removed the frames that people didn't want shown, the removal of certain frames would cause other actions to speed up by their very absence. So if you remove exit debris frames traveling to the left rear from that sequence of the shooting, then any motion the president's body had are going to be rapidly speeded up. And so I conclude today, I highly suspect that the rapidity and force of this motion back and to the left, the violent nature of it, is actually an unintended artifact of film alteration. It's an unintended artifact of removal of exit debris frames because none of the Dealey Plaza eyewitnesses saw it. I'm not saying the president didn't move back and to the left. I think he moved back and to the left much slower than you see in the film, and it's just been speeded up tremendously. Something to think about. Okay, one more indicator of possible alteration, likely alteration, is the car stop. Many witnesses claim to have seen the limousine stop during the shooting on Elm Street. The most eloquent witnesses were the people closest to the limousine. In other words, the people most likely to be reliable witnesses in this regard. I'm going to name a few of them. One of them is Bill Newman, who was standing with his wife Gail and his 2 little children just to the right of the limousine during the shooting. They threw their kids to the ground and covered them to try to keep their kids from being shot. But Bill Newman, starting in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, consistently told people that the car stopped very briefly during the shooting, very briefly, for about a second or a second and a half, and that there was no doubt in his mind this was the case. I had the privilege to talk to him on the phone in 2009, and he told me the same story. So he's a car stop witness. He was the closest person to the right of the limousine. Jean Hill, standing to the left of the limousine with her friend Mary Mormon. Jean Hill executed an affidavit for the sheriff's office that day, the day of the assassination. And in the midst of her affidavit, she says, I heard some shots, and then the car stopped for an instant, and then I heard some more shots. So that's another car stop witness adjacent to the limousine, just to the left of the limousine. Hugh Betzner is another persuasive car stop witness. Hugh Betzner was taking photographs of the motorcade from just behind the limousine and to the left, maybe 100 or 150 feet behind the limousine as it went down Elm Street. Mr. Betzner executed a sheriff's affidavit the day of the assassination, and twice in his affidavit, Betzner talks about the car stopping. So in one instance, he talks about seeing what he thought was a firecracker exploding in the car, and the car stopped for an instant. And in a later part of his affidavit, he talks about running immediately down the street to where the car had stopped. So that's three very reliable car stop witnesses. And another one is Mr. Hargis, the motorcycle cop to the immediate left rear of the limousine, who was splattered with blood and bloody water and brain matter during the assassination so forcefully that he thought he had been shot himself. He gave an interview to a newspaper which apparently was not published, but which author Richard Trask located. So in Richard Trask's book, Pictures of the Pain, he quotes this typed up interview quote of the newspaper with Officer Hargis, and he talks about the car stopping during the shooting. There are other people that talk about the car stopping. One of my friends did an analysis, and he decided that about 16 of the 52 witnesses were very, very persuasive and very reliable, and that others among the 52 people were farther away, and some of them were describing the way the car they were in stopped because they assumed the cars in front of them stopped. So at least 16 of these 52 people are very persuasive, and I think should be taken seriously. The last one I'll mention is Mr. Roy Truly. Roy Truly was one of Oswald's bosses in the book depository, and he gave a statement right after the assassination in which he said the limousine swerved sharply to the left during the shooting and stopped. So were all these people mistaken? And if so, how could they be mistaken in the same way? It's something to think about. You don't see a car stop in the Zapruder film today. You see the car slowing a bit, and people that have timed it have said, well, it seems to slow to about 9 miles an hour or something like that. And yet in other films taken from the other side, the Nix film and the Muchmore film, you can see the brake lights coming on. So this is, as I said, one of the four principal reasons, in addition to the blacking out of the exit wound in the back of the head. This is one of the four additional reasons why we believe the film may have been altered. Now, I'd like to shift this discussion to an aspect of the Zapruder film that most Americans don't know about yet. And it's something I have personal familiarity with, in which I'm well qualified to explain to you. And that is the chain of custody problems with the Zapruder film the very weekend of the assassination. The public story that everybody thought they knew for decades was that the Zapruder film was sold to life on Saturday. I'm now going to discuss an aspect of Zapruder film alteration that most Americans are not familiar with yet. And that is the serious break in the film's chain of custody the very weekend of the assassination. The most famous magazine in America at the time, the most famous pictorial spread magazine, news magazine, was Life magazine. And Life was owned and run by the Time Life Incorporated empire. And Life magazine's representative, Richard Stolley, purchased rights to the film, the rights to print still images from the film, from Abraham Zapruder on Saturday, November 23rd, the day after the film was developed in Dallas. Those rights from the first sale contract were the rights to borrow the original film for a week, and at which point Life magazine would have to return the original a week later, and then Zapruder would give them one of the copies. Those were the terms, and it was for $50,000, and it was print rights only. So at any rate, Mr. Stolley, after this contract was signed, put the camera original film, 8mm home movie, on an airplane to Chicago Saturday afternoon. He has said this consistently over the years. There's no reason not to believe him. I believe him. What happened to it after that is under dispute now. The story that people believed for decades was that the Life printing plant in Chicago had the film all weekend, from Saturday night on through the weekend, and that they took this original film, and from the original film, which is color, they made their first magazine spread of images from the Zapruder film. Now, the interesting thing is the first magazine spread was the November 29th issue of Life. It came out, the first issue was sold early on Tuesday the 26th, and subsequent issues were mailed out in the days after that. The first few issues came out Tuesday the 26th, but they didn't show color images. They showed very fuzzy, muddy-looking black and white images. It's always been a kind of a mystery. Why were the images so bad? Why were so many of them so tiny? And why were so few of them large images? And why were they of such poor quality? We'll talk more about that later. I think I know the reason now. At any rate, it was thought that Life had the film all weekend. We now know that that's not true. I'm going to give you the short version of what happened, and then I'm going to backtrack and explain to you how I came up with these conclusions. It's important that you understand how I came up with the conclusions for you to take them seriously. And you really need to take them seriously, because this is a rewriting of history so that we're no longer believing a myth and we're now believing the truth. The original Zapruder film wasn't in Chicago very long. It was diverted somewhere in Chicago and flown to Washington, D.C. on Saturday, the same day it was purchased. It arrived in Washington, D.C. at 10 o'clock p.m. Saturday night. It was sent to the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, this country's primary facility for analyzing photographs. Now, the NPIC, or NPIC as it was called, is the CIA facility which conducted photographic analysis primarily of U-2 photographs, U-2 aerial surveillance, or the early satellite reconnaissance photos from the Corona satellite program. They also conducted some human surveillance photographs, but mostly it was aerial. But this place was a joint national asset managed by the CIA with many members of the military working there, and they were the preeminent experts in this country in doing photographic analysis. So the original film went there at 10 o'clock at night, Saturday, and the mission for the NPIC was to make briefing boards, was to blow up individual frames, magnify individual frames from the Zapruder film, make prints, mount the prints on briefing boards on cardboard stock, 20 by 22 inches, almost a perfect square, and write notes of what you did, what you know about the film, what you understand about it, what frame number, things like that, what magnification factor, and make these briefing boards for government officials. The people that brought them the film, Secret Service agents, left at 3 a.m. the next morning, left at Sunday at 3 a.m., before the briefing boards were finished. The people at NPIC didn't know where they were going, but they left with the film at 3 a.m. The next night, Sunday night, well after dark, in other words, 24 hours after the Saturday night arrival of the film, another Zapruder film showed up at the NPIC. And once again, the mission of the NPIC was to make briefing boards, to blow up individual frames from the Z film, mount them on briefing board stock so that government officials could be briefed. That sounds a little strange, you may say. Didn't they just do it the night before? Well, they had done it the night before. And in fact, The work crew that had done the work the night before was not called in the next night on Sunday. A completely different crew was called in, which was highly unusual because the crew called in the previous night was the duty officer, Dino Brugioni, we'll be talking about Dino in just a minute, and department heads from the building. The head of the graphics department, Bill Banfield, and the head photogrammetrist, Ralph Pierce, plus worker bees to help them out. So 3 big shot managers were called in to do that work Saturday night. That makes sense to me. Much lower level people were called in the next night. A completely different work crew was called in, which is really rings alarm bells. This is one of the hallmarks of a compartmentalized operation. You call in a different crew of people so they don't know what happened the night before, and so that the people who worked on the film the night before don't know what happened the second night. So the Zapruder film, which was brought to the InPic Sunday night for the second briefing board event, was brought to them, the courier said, from Rochester, New York, from Kodak headquarters, from the world's premier research and development lab called Hawkeye Works. Hawkeye Works was Kodak's own R&D facility where they developed all kinds of new products, new motion picture film, you name it, new still picture film, and it was also the facility where they did highly classified work for the CIA. The CIA had classified contracts in place for Kodak to do work for them at Hawkeye Works related to the U-2 program and the Corona programs. But I can assure you that much more was done at Hawkeye Works than just CIA work on U-2 and Corona photos. So the courier, a Secret Service agent, brought the film from Rochester, New York. He says, I've come from Hawkeye Works, and he said, I want certain frames magnified and blown up and made into briefing boards. He then proceeded to tell lies about the film. He told the work crew at InPic for the second event that this was a camera original film and it had been developed at Hawkeye Works. Now we know that's not true. We know the camera original Zapruder film was developed Friday in Dallas. Everyone knows that. It's well documented. It was developed Friday in Dallas. 3 contact prints were then exposed. They were then developed, and all 4 films were slit from the 16 millimeter format they were in the camera, 16 millimeters wide, image strips from side A and B going in opposite directions, upside down and backwards. They were then slit after developing into 8 millimeter wide films. So the original film and the 3 first-day copies were developed in Dallas on Friday. Everyone knows that. Everyone accepts that today. No one questions that. It's a fact. The Secret Service agent, who, by the way, called himself Bill Smith, which is highly questionable, Bill Smith told the InPic crew Sunday night that the Zapruder film he was delivering to them was the camera original film that had been developed in Rochester at Hawkeye Works. They knew what that meant. They knew what Hawkeye Works was. The problem was the film was not 8 millimeters wide. It was suddenly 16 millimeters wide again. In other words, the film brought to these people Sunday night for the making of briefing board set number 2 was no longer slit to 8 millimeters like the film brought to InPic Saturday night. The film brought Saturday night, which that work crew, by the way, Dino Brugioni is convinced it was the original film. He's convinced of it because it was so sharp and so clear. And he remembers they had to go out and open up a photography store and buy and purchase an 8 millimeter projector so they could actually project the film and look at it before they worked on it. Because they didn't have any 8 millimeter projectors at InPic. They had 16 millimeter and 35. They didn't have 8 millimeter. So it's a fact that an 8 millimeter original was delivered to InPic Saturday night, per Dino Brugioni. Sunday night, what was delivered was this 16 millimeter double 8 film that had not yet been slit down the middle, which is what normally happens at the factory. And the technician, Homer McMahon, who's the head of the color lab, the technician making the blow-ups, the inner negatives from which he made prints of the individual frames, that technician recalled seeing in his enlarger, vividly recalled, seeing the upside down and backwards image strips of a double 8 film which had not yet been slit. This was very clear in his memory. So what happened, it's clear to me, was alterations of some type were performed on the film at Hawkeye Works all day long on Sunday. A new Zapruder film was created masquerading as a camera original film. Masquerading in the sense that it was 16 millimeters wide again. And the whole movie had optically been reunited with the Elm Street scenes, and the film hadn't been split yet. Secret Service agent who served as courier on Sunday night and brought another Zapruder film to INPIC from Rochester, from Hawkeye Works, told another lie. He told them that the citizen who donated the film had done so free of charge and didn't want any financial remuneration, didn't want any money. He did it as a patriotic act. We know that's not true. Abraham Zapruder signed a contract on Saturday for $50,000 just to give Life magazine print rights for 1 week. And then on Monday, Life executed a new contract with him, to his benefit, not to theirs, selling it to him a second time for $150,000 total instead of $50,000. And the deal on Monday was Life wanted everything. Life wanted the original film and all the copies in its permanent custody, and they wanted all rights worldwide, including motion picture rights. So the point here is that there was no patriotic citizen who had donated the Zapruder film at no cost to the government. That was a fiction. So clearly, if Bill Smith says Bill Smith was the name of the Secret Service agent. If Bill Smith says he came from Rochester, from Hawkeye Works, with the film, and it had just been developed there, that part's true, but it was not a camera original film, and it was not a donation. It was clearly a reconstructed Zapruder film designed to mimic what an out-of-camera original would look like. The next dot in the series of dots that I'm connecting is the story of what images were on the set of briefing boards made Sunday night and what images were in Life magazine the week after the assassination. The briefing boards made at event number 2 still survive. One set of 4 briefing boards still survives. It's in the National Archives in flat number 90A in the JFK Records collection. You can go see it by appointment today. 4 long panels that are not square, long rectangular panels with a total of 28 prints on the 4 panels. The images in those prints and the frame numbers associated with them match the film as we know it today in the archives. The images of the assassination published in Life magazine in the November 29th issue match the images shown in the film today in the National Archives. You see the massive head wound, the top of the head apparently gone, the right side of the head blown open, etc., etc. So, the conclusion I draw from this is that whatever alteration was accomplished was very hurried. It was a rush job. It was completed by Sunday night after probably only a 12 to 14-hour period to do the work. And at that time, 2 things happened. We know that the new original was taken to Washington to INPIC for the making of sanitized briefing boards. The other thing that happened was that apparently dirty dupes were made of this new Zapruder film. Fuzzy, imperfect, black and white copies were made. Because today, in the 6th floor museum, there exists a set of dirty dupes, 3 dirty dupes made of the Zapruder film. It's the Zapruder film as we know it today. And one of these dirty dupes has the markings on it consistent with the exact frames that were reproduced in Life magazine in the November 29th issue. So you can tell this is the work print, if you will, that the people at Life worked with to put those first frames in the magazine. And I conclude that the reason Life magazine published such terrible versions of the Zapruder film starting on Tuesday, the day after the funeral, in the November 29th issue, the reason the images were so poor and were black and white and were so fuzzy and muddy is because they didn't yet have the new original returned to them. It was still in the hands of the government. And the only thing that Hawkeye Works could get to Chicago Sunday night were these black and white dirty dupes. So It's my conclusion that that's why the first Z-frames published in Life magazine were of such poor quality. But the image content is the same as that in the film today. So I think a rush job was done at Hawkeye Works on Sunday. The technology of the day, the analog technology of the time, was only capable of altering certain things in a film. There was no CGI at the time, no computer-generated imagery, no digital technology. All they had was analog technology, the tried and true techniques used by Hollywood. So my conclusion is that the film was altered in a limited way, in the ways I've already discussed, by the use of optical printers and the technique of aerial imaging. It was a rush job. It was an imperfect job of alteration, very imperfect. Now, one unintended artifact of alteration, as I've already discussed, was speeding up the motion of the body to the left and the rear. Speeding that up and making it look so much more violent really implied a frontal shot, as we all know. That's the impression we get when we watch the Zapruder film for the first time. And it's the same impression we get when we watch the Zapruder film for the 100th time, is that guy was shot from the front. That, I believe, was an unintended artifact of alteration, of frame excision, optical frame excision, removal of exit debris frames from the left rear. So the motion of the body speeded up. It made it look like JFK was shot from the front. That was not a good thing for the people engaged in this cover-up. The people trying to sell the legend of a lone assassin firing from above and behind. The other thing that was not good was the crude blackouts on the back of the head, which you can now see today with today's modern digitized scanning technology on individual frames of the Z film. You can see the blackouts of the back of the head, exactly where all the Dallas witnesses and Clint Hill saw an exit wound. You can see crude animation blacking out the back of the head. So because of these two problems, this is why I believe Life magazine suppressed the film as a motion picture for 12 years, never once exploited it as a motion picture, never once licensed it to anyone to use commercially as a motion picture for 12 years, after spending $100,000 extra to get its hands on the so-called original and to get motion picture rights. Life magazine didn't use that capability. That doesn't make any business sense, but it does make sense if the goal is to suppress the film. So let's go through what happened that weekend, and let's examine who Dino Brugione was and what happened during these two briefing board events. As I've discussed, an 8mm wide slit Zapruder film arrived at the National Photographic Interpretation Center Saturday night. It was there from about 10 p.m. Saturday night until about 3 a.m. Sunday morning, the 24th. Enlargements were made in the world's state-of-the-art enlarger, the 10 by 20 by 40 enlarger. Enlargements, that is, inner negatives were made, and then prints were made from the inner negatives, and briefing boards were made. This was event number one. As I've said, a second set of briefing boards, apparently of an altered Zapruder film, were prepared one day later at INPIC on the next evening, on the evening of Sunday, November 24th, and into Monday morning, 1963. As I've said, this second film was an unslit, 16mm wide, double-8 film, displaying all the characteristics of an as-yet unslit camera original home movie. It was couriered to INPIC from a highly classified Kodak film lab in Rochester called the Hawkeye plant. Now, the Hawkeye plant was Kodak's name for its R&D facility. The CIA's name for the facility was a code named called Hawkeye Works. And the agent who brought the film to INPIC Sunday night said, "I've just come from Hawkeye Works in Rochester. That's where this film was developed." That's important to understand that the briefing boards from event number one apparently convinced CIA Director John McCone that JFK was not killed by a lone gunman, but rather by multiple shooters. Those briefing boards from event number one cannot be located today. These briefing boards from event number one, made by Dino Brugione and his team, were much different in character from the briefing boards made at event number two, 24 hours later. The briefing boards from event one, there were two briefing board sets. Each set was two panels joined together by a hinge in the middle so that they could be closed, like a butterfly's wings. And each of those panels was 20 by 22 inches. The hinge in the middle allowed them to close. The total number of prints on each one of those briefing board sets was 12 to 15 prints. And the only information displayed was frame number, which they had to count manually, frame number and magnification factor, how much they were enlarged in the enlarger. We know from the writings of historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his book RFK and His Times that CIA Director John McCone got together with Bobby Kennedy, the deceased president's brother. He was still Attorney General in name, if not in fact, and told him shortly after the assassination that his conclusion was that there was more than one gunman, that there were two shooters. This first set of briefing boards from an unaltered Zapruder film is most likely the source of that conclusion, one would think. I think it's a reasonable speculation. Now, one set of briefing boards, as I've said, from Event 2 survives today in the National Archives. Unfortunately, the briefing boards from Event Number 1 have disappeared. Two briefing boards were made. One was for Director McCone. One was for the customer, the Secret Service. The Secret Service is the outfit that commissioned the making of the briefing boards. They wanted these made so they could brief government officials, so they could understand what had happened. So two sets were made. Neither one of them exists today. But we have one set of 4 briefing board panels, which are not connected by any hinge, one set of 4 panels that does exist today from Event Number 2. Now, as I've said, Events 1 and 2 utilize completely different teams. In view of the reasons to suspect that this film has been altered, this is very suspicious activity. The team at Event Number 2, Homer McMahon and his assistant Ben Hunter, were told by the Secret Service agent Bill Smith that they were not allowed to discuss their activity with anyone else, including their own supervisors. They were told that if their own supervisors questioned the reasons for their overtime, they were to refer them to Captain Sands. Captain Sands was the official who opened the building that night for Homer McMahon and Ben Hunter. Captain Sands was the deputy director of the facility. Bill Smith also told them that the image content in the film was to be treated as above top secret. There were no classification labels put on the briefing boards themselves, but they were told that it was to be treated as above top secret. Now, Dino Brugioni, who was the chief information officer at the INPIC, he was the right-hand man of the director, Arthur Lundell. Dino Brugioni has recalled a different image content for the head explosion in the Zapruder film than the head explosion we see in the film today. So if you access the Zapruder film today from any number of sources, and you look at frame 313, you will see that there's one frame that graphically depicts an explosion near President Kennedy's head. And the explosion is pink or red or orange in nature, depending on which version of the Zapruder film you look at. It's very bright in color. And the explosion is actually down low. It's down near the front part of his head. Actually, I think it's away from his head. It's not even on his head. It's like out here. But that head explosion is something that anyone who's watched the film, especially in slow motion, can readily recall. Dino Brugioni, a man with impeccable credentials, as I said, recalls a very different head explosion than seen in the film today. This is another reason to believe that he did see the camera original film Saturday night, and that the film he saw Saturday night was very different from the one seen the next day on Sunday evening at the same facility. One or two JFK researchers had contacted Dino Brugioni before 2009, but the information they got was hard to understand, and I don't think it was well documented. In 2009, Peter Janney, a JFK researcher in New England and the author of the book Mary's Mosaic, Peter Janney called Dino Brugioni out of the blue. It was a cold telephone call. And Peter said to Dino, "Are you Dino Brugioni, who used to work at INPIC?" And Dino said, "Yes, I am. What can I do for you?" Peter said, "Well, my father used to work for the CIA, and his name was Fred Janney." And Dino says, "Oh, yeah, I knew Fred Janney. I knew him well." And so Peter said, "Okay." So Peter said, "I've been studying some interviews that the review board did with some INPIC employees about their work with the Zapruder film," and he said, "I wanted to ask you some questions." He said, "Would you talk to me?" Dino readily agreed. He said, "Sure." So during 2009, Peter Janney proceeded to interview Dino Brugione 8 or 9 times. Each of these was a lengthy interview recorded on MP3 media. Peter contacted me after the very first interview and said, "I have an interesting witness here. Let me tell you what he just told me. Let's develop some more questions." So I worked with Peter Janney in a partnership throughout 2009 to develop a series of increasingly complex questions for Dino about the event he monitored. And by the end of the year, we had a pretty good feel for what he did on Saturday night, November 23rd, and early Sunday morning, November 24th. We had a pretty good sense of it. And I trusted Dino Brugione completely. If you Google Dino Brugione, or put him into any search engine, and read his biography on Wikipedia, you'll see that he is today the foremost living photo interpreter from the era of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He knows more than anyone alive on the planet Earth, has more experience with photo interpretation from that era, and at that time he was the world's second leading photo interpreter. The only person better than him was his boss, Arthur Lundell. And Arthur Lundell and Dino were the plank owners. They were the co-founders of the NPIC in 1955. So this is a high-level, reliable, highly credible expert we were dealing with, a man who had received a national medal for his work during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This man, Dino Brugione, was the chief information officer at NPIC. He made all the briefing boards for all the government officials made by NPIC for 3 decades. So he made briefing boards for President Eisenhower, he and his staff, for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, and attended personally many of the briefings in the White House cabinet room when his boss would go over, Arthur Lundell, with the notes that Dino had prepared. Arthur Lundell would give the briefing, would present the briefing boards. Dino would be sitting in the room. So Dino was a man who had access to presidents, who did work for presidents and cabinet members, and who was trusted by everyone. So by the end of 2009, we had a good account of what Dino had done during event number 1. And then we were surprised, as you so often are with witnesses, when you think you've got everything there is to get, you find out you were wrong. In 2011, Peter Janney visited Dino Brugione at his home, took with him an image of frame 313, the head explosion, and showed it to Dino Brugione and said, "Is this the head explosion you saw when you looked at the Zapruder film? You keep talking about how shocked you were when you saw the president's brains flying through the air. Is this what you saw?" And Dino immediately said, "No, this is not what I saw." And as he continued to talk with Peter, he became more and more agitated, that the explosion he remembered was much bigger, went much higher in the air, and could not have been just one frame. Must have been many more frames than just one frame. Later that year, I conducted a video interview of Dino, in which he also told me that the head explosion he witnessed was not red or pink. It was a white mist, so it went much higher in the air. There was a huge piece of debris flying into the air from the president's head. The head explosion was a white mist, not red and bloody colored. So that cinched it for me that the film today, the Zapruder film we have today in the National Archives, is an altered film. That completely convinced me beyond any shadow of a doubt. So I'm going to play for you now an extended audio excerpt that's 4.5 minutes long of Peter Janney's interview with Dino in April of 2011 when Peter first showed him an image of frame 313. This is Dino Brugione's reaction to seeing that frame.
Okay, extant film, Dino. This is the only frame where you have any indication of, his brains exploding.
Oh, it went into the air. I remember it went in the air.
Was it more than one frame? It would have to have been, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, see, there's only one frame on the entire Zapruder film, frame 313, that gives any indication of that.
No, it was I remember it was in the sky.
Yeah, but you see, that's the only frame. It's just one frame. This, now we go up to 635, 335, but let's go back to 313, okay? That's the
There's
only,
no 314?
yeah, there is a 314, but it has none of this, pink haze, blood water.
No, I remember all of us being shocked.
And was it going out the back when you saw it?
It was going out front.
It was going out the front.
Going up.
Up, okay. But was it leaving a trail in the rear?
No, it was straight up.
Uh-huh.
I remember.
But if that event took place, wouldn't you suspect to see it on more than one frame?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And because you're shooting, what, 18 frames per second? Isn't that what that camera did?
There should have been more than one frame.
Yeah, right. There should have been. Because here now is a picture.
There's no doubt in my mind, and I remember all of us being shocked because I thought the spray was say 3 or 4 feet from his head.
Uh-huh. Up in the air.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, see, here we are again. I want to just have you look at this one more time. So,
what I saw was more than that.
more. This is frame 313. So you saw more pink mist going up, straight up.
What I remember it was like right here, but high.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't low, it was high.
Uh-huh. Now, okay, so this is the only frame on the whole Zapruder film that you get to see.
No, there was more than that.
So you're saying there was more than one frame, for sure. How many frames do you think there would be?
I don't know, but all I know is that we were shocked when we saw it.
Right. For nearly 50 years.
Well, now they claim that if you go down to the archives, you ask for the Zapruder film, they claim that that's the true one?
That's the true one, right. The one the frames that we just looked at. No? You're shaking your head. That's not the true one, is it? Is that what you mean?
I say the one that I saw, man, his head, it was way high off of his head.
Yeah. The debris.
And I can't imagine that there would only be one frame.
Right. That's it. Right there.
Because that film, I remember looking at the film, and I remember how shocked we were. All of us that were there were shocked.
And you wouldn't have, there couldn't have been that much of a shock if there was just one frame, right? That would have gone by pretty quickly.
No, that's right.
Right?
Yeah. So,
this is a pretty dramatic event that lasted probably, 2 or 3 seconds at least, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was more than just what I saw was more than what you had there.
Now I'd like to go back to the 2 NPIC events and summarize the differences between events 1 and 2. Event number 1 was presided over by Duty Officer Dino Bruzioni, assisted by Ralph Pierce and Bill Banfield. A slit 8mm film was brought by 2 Secret Service agents directly from the airport at 10 p.m. Saturday night, November 23rd. This is significant. Directly from the airport. They had not yet seen the film. An 8mm projector had to be purchased to view it. 2 briefing boards were made after they left at 3 a.m. with the film in hand. The briefing boards were 2 panels each, joined by a hinge in the middle, and contained 12 to 15 prints. Now, event number 2 was quite different. It occurred 24 hours later, late Sunday night, well after dark, on November 24th. That's when it commenced. It ended on the next morning, November 25th. Navy Captain Sands, the deputy director of NPIC, introduced 1 Secret Service agent, Bill Smith, to Homer McMahon, the head of the Color Lab, and his young assistant, Ben Hunter, who had just gotten out of the Air Force and just gone to work for the CIA. Now, Bill Smith stated he couriered the original film from Hawkeye Works in Rochester, New York. The film was a 16 millimeter unslit double-8 film. 3 sets of prints were made of each blow-up frame, and only 1 set of the 4-panel briefing board survives today, but we do have 1 set. Let's look at those images. This is panel number 1 from NPIC event number 2. So this is NPIC panel 1. This is all from event number 2. This is panel number 2. This is panel number 3. And this is panel number 4. The total number of frames is 28 frames. I've conducted an extensive frame assignment analysis of these 28 frames. These 28 frame numbers are written down in working notes made by Homer McMahon and Ben Hunter. So I compared each one of these frames with that frame number, that corresponding frame number in the film we know today in the archives. And they are all either exactly identical, in other words, the image content is the same and the frame number is exactly the same, or it's only 1 frame number off. So there were a few frames later in the sequence where the frame number is 1 frame off, and I account that to simple human fatigue and error during the counting process, because these people had to count the frames by hand. I mean, they're not numbered on the film. They had to count them by hand, and you're dealing with an 8 millimeter strip of film that's very thin, and it would have been a very tedious process. So my frame assignment analysis verifies to me that the images on these briefing boards, as I said earlier, are the same as in the extant film in the archives today. That tells me that the alteration was completed. The same wounds seen in the Zapruder film in the archives today were seen in Life magazine in the November 29th issue. So I want to reiterate, the alteration was a rush job. There were only so many things that could be done to the film with the technology of the day, and it was completed after 12 to 14 hours. I'd like to point out one more thing about these 4 briefing board panels. If you look at the head explosion on panel 4, which you can see here, you'll see 2 colored triangles below the print. That possibly implies a double headshot. On the 4 briefing board panels, there are a total of 6 colored triangles. They clearly, I mean, they seem to me to be someone's impression or idea of how many shots hit the occupants of the limousine. Let's go back, in fact, let's go back and look at panel 1 and look for the colored triangles. Now in this panel, in panel number 1, you can see 2 colored triangles. One is in between the first 2 frames, and just below the frames, there is a red triangle. And then on the second row, as the limousine begins to come out from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign, you see another colored triangle. So that's 2 triangles on panel 1. Let's go to panel 2. On panel 2, there's another colored triangle in the middle row between the first and second prints. It's a blue triangle. Let's go to panel 3. Panel 3 displays 1 colored triangle. It's on the first row, just prior to the first print on the left. So that's 4 so far. Let's go to the final panel, panel 4. You see 2 colored triangles below frame 313, the headshot. So to reiterate, there are a total of 6 colored triangles in the surviving briefing board panels. It's of great interest to me and should be to anyone who studies the film. I don't have definitive proof as to what they represented, but I think it's a reasonable conclusion that it was somebody's idea of where shots hit occupants of the limousine. Now this is a photograph in this slide of Dino Brugioni as he appeared in 2011 when I conducted my video interview of him. His mind was still very sharp. He was 91 years old at the time. His mind was extremely sharp. You can watch an interview online with me discussing the Zapruder film and with extended excerpts of Dino Brugioni discussing the Zapruder film that's been put online by Irish filmmaker Shane O'Sullivan. It's at the Vimeo site. At the end of this presentation, I will give you the address to my blog site. My blog site will lead you to the link to that 85-minute interview. But if you want to assess Dino Brugioni's credibility yourself, I encourage you to watch that 85-minute interview. You can make your own decision. Now, this slide summarizes the fact that Dino Brugioni is adamant that he did not make the 4 briefing board panels that are in the archives today. He insisted on this to Peter Janney in 2009 in numerous interviews, and he reaffirmed it for me in his July 2011 video interview. This confirms that there were 2 events that weekend. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly, about an ongoing effort in Hollywood to analyze the altered image content in the Zapruder film. 2 close friends of mine in California, Sidney Wilkinson and Tom Whitehead, together engaged in a joint husband-wife research project back in 2008. Sidney decided to purchase a duplicate 35mm negative, a dupe negative of the Zapruder film from the National Archives. She knew that the film had been purchased by the American people at great expense. She knew it was in the archives. She decided she wanted to purchase a copy of the Zapruder film. So after she obtained permission from the copyright holder, the archives told her to select which contractor she wanted, and they authorized her to have a contractor make a 35mm dupe negative of the film. So she has a 35mm dupe negative, which is only a 3rd generation copy. It's a copy very, very close to the original. I'll be discussing in the next slide this research effort, which is ongoing in California, to study the image content in the film. Sidney did not know what to expect when she purchased this dupe negative of the Z film. She was just curious about all the film issues. She didn't know what to believe, whether it was altered or not. And she shared a natural curiosity with many of us, so she decided to do something about it. So for the cost of $795, she purchased a 35mm dupe negative, which, by the way, any of you can do if you so desire. Okay, in just one slide, I'm going to briefly discuss the research effort going on out in California. My friends in California, once they received the dupe negative, they made 2 sets of digital scans of the film. One was an HD scan of the same resolution that you see in your large screen TV set today. Your high definition TV set, 1920 by 1080 pixels per frame, is the same resolution of their HD set of scans. They made a second set of digital scans of each frame at this current state-of-the-art 6K, which means that one 6K scan of one Zapruder film frame has a total of over 28.6 million pixels of information per frame. 6,144 pixels on one axis by 4,668 on another axis. Very, very high resolution. The current film restorations for famous films such as Lawrence of Arabia and the 10 Commandments were done in 4K. So these 6K digital scans of the dupe negative of the Z film are very important forensic tools. The scans were done in logarithmic color, not the linear color that you see in documentaries and television shows. So at first glance, they appear to be a little bit flat scans, a little bit washed out, but they reveal a maximum in image content. Anybody in the film industry who studies film in a forensic manner is going to use logarithmic color to study the film. When they're finished doing their study and their manipulations, they then convert it back to linear for public display. So to sum up here, the digital scans of numerous frames in this 35mm dupe negative reveal significant anomalies, which appear to be crude blacking out of the true exit wound seen at Parkland Hospital. Was this possible with the technology of the day? In other words, was it possible to use animation techniques, the kind of animation techniques that Walt Disney would use in a cartoon, to black out wounds in a photograph and possibly paint on other wounds under the images? The answer is yes. This slide, which I obtained from a 1965 textbook called The Technique of Special Effects Cinematography by Professor Raymond Fielding, depicts what is known as an aerial imaging setup. Now, a professional in the trade who worked in those times would call this an aerial optical printer. This is a schematic simplified diagram of what a modified optical printer would look like in an aerial imaging setup. An animation stand is installed in the middle of the gear. The original frames, which are projected from a camera on the floor, are sent up through a condenser lens. They're blown up in size. They're projected onto the animation stand, and an acetate cell is placed on top of the animation stand, which is perfectly clear. You can draw any artwork you want on the acetate cell. You can black out the back of the head where the exit wound is. You can paint on new wounds on the top of the head, which match the autopsy photographs if you want. And then that altered image is rephotographed one time by a process camera at the top of the image here. So the beauty of aerial imaging is it requires a minimum of time and only one pass with a process camera. So each frame that you would alter with animation would be rephotographed one time with a process camera, and in that way a new film could be created. This next slide shows a photograph from Fielding's textbook of a modified Oxberry optical printer with an animation stand in the middle. And you'll notice from the dress of the individual in the photo that this photo was clearly taken in the 1950s. He's not wearing 1960s clothing. What I'd like to show you now is a blow-up of this image, which you can now see on your screens. You can see the animation stand in the center of the image. The man is looking down at the animation stand. The process camera is at the top of the rig, and the playback camera is at the bottom. And for those of you who have a really good screen and can read the text, you can see that it says that aerial imaging is self-matting and only one pass is required to produce a new film frame. So yes, I conclude that the technology was available in 1963 to alter the Zapruder film in the ways that I have postulated. The technology did not exist in 1963 to alter significant aspects of the film. For example, to alter the motion of the president's body in the car. That's why we have an altered Zapruder film, and yet it shows apparent evidence of conspiracy, of a shot from the front, back and to the left. The president's body is slammed back and to the left. The reason that's still in the film and wasn't removed is because the technology did not exist to remove that part of the image. The only technology available, as I can best determine, and as my film friends in Hollywood can best determine, was the ability to black something out or paint something on. That was about it. You could not add new bodies to the film or change the position of bodies. You could remove frames optically through step printing, but you could not perform miracles. So I conclude that the alteration was limited in nature, was rushed by time considerations, because at the time no one knew what investigations there would be of the assassination. People were anticipating congressional investigations in both houses. They were anticipating a Texas inquest and anticipating who knows what, and a trial they were anticipating. So at least early Sunday morning they were. And so in my opinion, it was a rush job, and that's why it was imperfect. And that's why we can detect the alterations today, is because it was a bad job. It was a rush job. The alterations were imperfect, were not extremely well done, and were limited by the technology of the day. They were good enough to show this film at regular speed on a little homemade movie screen with an 8mm home projector and fool somebody. The alterations were not good enough to loan the film to an expert and let him examine frame by frame in high magnification. Now let's review Dino Brigione's recollections of the headshot. Let's review what he says about the headshot that he saw that is different from the headshot we know today. Number one, he says the head explosion was quite shocking, much higher in the air than in frame 313, and that a large piece of skull or other biological material was launched into the air. He does not recall the red mist seen in frame 313 today. Instead, he recalls a white mist. And he insists that the head explosion he witnessed was of such a duration and time that it could not have been just one frame. It had to consist of more than one frame. Dino is adamant about this. Let me explain how we can be so sure. The factory-designed operating speed of the Zapruder camera was 16 frames per second. As tested after the assassination, the average speed was determined to be a little bit fast, about 18.3 frames per second. But whether the film was shot at 16 or 18, that's 16 or 18 different photographs taken of action every second. And if there had been a massive head explosion, with mist hanging in the air and debris flying through the air, surely it would have lasted more than 1/16th or 1/18th of a second, surely. And apparently Dino's recollection is so vivid of some sense of time duration of what they all witnessed that he's convinced that it cannot have just been one frame. So he doubts the validity of the current film. He doubts its authenticity for all three of these reasons. Now, Professor Raymond Fielding, the author of the textbook I mentioned earlier, has been quoted by one of my adversaries in this matter as saying the following, quote, "If such an attempt at image manipulation had occurred in 1963, the results could not possibly have survived professional scrutiny," unquote. That's what's happening today in California. About 40 film professionals in Los Angeles have viewed the digital scans of these frames from the Z film. All of them have said that the so-called shadows on the back of the head, the blacking out, look extremely peculiar, unlike anything they've ever seen come out of a camera, unlike anything made by nature. And about a third of these people have just flat said outright, this film's been altered and this is the proof. Many of them suspect that the large head wound seen on top of President Kennedy's head and on the right side, many of them suspect that that part of the image has been added on as an alteration also. And some of the people that have said this are people that don't know anything about the Kennedy assassination. They don't know anything about the autopsy photos. They just said, this doesn't look right. So it's my contention that the quote by Professor Fielding is correct, that that type of alteration would not withstand professional scrutiny, because today it is not withstanding such scrutiny. It has never been subjected to that kind of scrutiny until the present day. Professionals in Hollywood, film editors, film restoration experts, and colorists begin viewing the 35 millimeter dupe negative digital scans back in 2009. And people are still being shown these images today. The film, as it exists today, as viewed with today's enhanced technology, is not withstanding professional scrutiny. So all I can tell you is to stay tuned. My friends in California are working very hard on a documentary and will release it as soon as possible. But I believe that this documentary will change the world and will convince the world that the Zapruder film is not an authentic film, not as we know it today. So in summary, the Zapruder film had to hide the results of a fatal shot from the front and also depict a large exit wound, consistent with the autopsy wound photos, in order to sell the idea of a lone assassin firing from behind. Now, the two compartmentalized in-pick operations with the Z film and what happened to the film in between those two operations, which I've already discussed in depth, are evidence that alteration did take place and that it was carried out by the U.S. government immediately after the assassination. The Secret Service and the CIA were all over this film the weekend of the assassination. All over it. Intense interest was expressed. And the film went to a place where the capabilities surely existed to alter the film. I'm talking about optical printers at Hawkeye Works. Now, Dino Brugione visited Hawkeye Works more than once. And he told me that he visited it at least once before the assassination. And the director of the facility, Mr. Green, who worked for Kodak, told Dino that, quote, they could do anything with film at Hawkeye Works. Mr. Green said, we can do anything. So Dino did not tour the entire facility. He toured the part of the facility dedicated to U-2 and Corona satellite photography. But the director of the facility repeatedly told him that they had incredible capabilities to do things with films. Apparently, the one thing they could not do was do 40 times magnification with it and larger. So, film had to go twice to Washington to make these blow-ups for briefing boards, because Washington had the 10 by 20 by 40 above state-of-the-art and larger. But you can be sure that since Hawkeye Works was a research and development facility for new motion picture products, that it had optical printers. And from there, you can figure out the rest of the story. Now, this alteration at Hawkeye Works occurred on Sunday. It occurred one day after the first autopsy photographs were developed. The first autopsy photos were developed on Saturday, November 23rd. So by that time, the size and scope of the head wound was known. The Zapruder film had to be made to match, roughly match, the so-called wound damage seen in the autopsy photographs. An entire new film was created at the Hawkeye plant in Rochester, masquerading as an apparent camera original film. So to conclude here, the research being conducted on the digital scans on the West Coast revealed that the alteration included hiding the true exit wound in the rear of the skull, and much other evidence indicates that a false exit wound was almost certainly painted on frames of JFK's head, consistent with the official cover story. Now, you can go to almost any version of the Z film available today at YouTube or in any book, or you can access the DVD, Image of an Assassination, and examine frame 317 as closely as possible. I also encourage you to examine frames 321 and 323 and one of the Stemmons freeway signs, frame 220. In frame 220, you'll see a serious anomaly in the corner of the sign, and the pictures are worth 1,000 words. So those are the 4 frames I would refer people to. Frame 220, 317 especially, 321, and 323. Now, there are 2 additional frames which are of great interest, frames 335 and 337, which you can view in any version of the Zapruder film. Frames 335 and 337 depict an enormous wound on top of the head and on the right side of the head that no one saw in Dallas, Texas. No one saw it in Dealey Plaza. No one saw it at Parkland Hospital. And that is the reason that those frames are of particular interest to researchers, as they show a wound that just wasn't seen by anybody in Dallas the day the president was assassinated. So, this is the point I'm trying to make. If you believe the Dallas doctors, and you believe they're trustworthy, and you believe Clint Hill, and you believe Tom Robinson, and you believe the 2 FBI agents at the autopsy, and you believe Admiral Berkeley and Captain Canada that the president had an exit wound in the right rear of his head, shouldn't it trouble you that you don't see that exit wound in the Zapruder film today? Because you don't. Instead of that wound, you see a very, very dark area. And in frame 317, the dark area has unusually straight edges. It looks very artificial, very unlike a real shadow on human hair. So, study the images yourself and make up your own mind. But, once again, if you believe the president had an exit wound here, you should be asking yourself, why don't I see that on the Zapruder film? There was more than enough light that day in Dealey Plaza to expose such a wound, if it had been present. You don't see it in the extant film. Instead, you see a black patch in several frames. This is the key to understanding and believing that the film was altered. I would say the second most important fact to keep in mind is the head explosion, and the fact that Dino Brugione saw a very different head explosion than you see in the film today. Dino Brugione's high degree of trustworthiness and his high level of credibility have convinced me and have convinced Peter Janney and many other people that he's telling the truth when he says he saw a very different head explosion in the Z film than we see today. I trust his recollections. So by now you should begin to see a very serious pattern in the evidence. The chain of custody of key evidence is disrupted or falls apart time after time. The chain of custody in the Tippit shooting falls apart. The shell casings and the bullets from the Tippit shooting fall apart. They don't match each other, and they don't match the initials, markings people made on them that day. So that evidence is suspect. The chain of custody of the magic bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, falls apart if you read the FBI report written in July 1964. Somebody in the FBI was honest Somebody told an agent to go out in the field and interview everyone who handled the magic bullet, the stretcher bullet, the day it was found. And somebody did that. And they wrote an honest report. And if you read that report, you're going to be shocked at how the chain of custody of that bullet simply falls apart. The bullet in the archives today is not the same shape or type as the bullet found on a stretcher. And several of the witnesses say they could not positively identify it as the bullet they handled that day. I believe only one witness said that he could, and that was the last fellow who handled it. So the chain of custody on the autopsy report, as you now know, has completely fallen apart. The original draft was burned. The original notes were burned, except for one page. The first signed copy disappeared, and the autopsy report in the archives is at least the third written version. So there's no chain of custody there. The chain of custody of the autopsy photo collection is seriously suspect, since there are as many as 18 views missing today. I discuss the details of this in my book in chapter 4. So not only are there missing autopsy photographs, but as we know, many of the photographs depict images that are completely inconsistent with what was seen in Dallas. And some autopsy photographs, like the back of the head images, depict things that no one saw in Dallas, and that very few people say they saw at the Bethesda autopsy. Only the 3 autopsy pathologists who are already in this cover-up up to here, only those 3 people have looked at the back of the head photos and claimed that, well, yes, that's pretty much the way the head looked, except that the entrance wound is in the wrong place. Everyone else at the autopsy that I know of has looked at those images and said, that's not what I saw at the autopsy. I saw the right rear of the head missing, or I saw the whole head opened up like this, after the surgery. So I think the autopsy photographs would be challenged on an individual basis at trial, and very few, if any, would be admitted to trial. The final point that I'd like to reiterate is that the chain of custody of the brain photos in the autopsy photo collection has been destroyed. They cannot be images of JFK's brain. They're taken on the wrong kind of film. They're shot from the wrong vantage point. They don't include the pictures of sections that were taken. And one point that I failed to mention earlier is that one of our consultants at the review board, Dr. Kirshner, who is a forensic pathologist of worldwide repute, Dr. Kirshner looked at those brain images, and without really knowing much about the Kennedy assassination, he said, this brain looks very old. He said, this brain is at least 2 or 3 weeks old because it's very well fixed. It is not pink in color at all. It's all gray. And he said, so this brain could not have had these photos taken soon after the autopsy. I looked at Jeremy Gunn and he looked at me, and we knew that that was a gotcha moment. That was an epiphany, because we know that President Kennedy's brain was examined 3 days after the autopsy, on Monday, November 25th, 2.5 days later, not 3, and that it would not have had this appearance. It would not have looked gray. It would have looked pink or red at the brain exam. So all of these multiple proofs point to one pattern: interrupted chain of custody, destruction of evidence, and substitution of false evidence. So if you have felt uncomfortable for years with the conclusions of the Warren Commission, now you have several good reasons to back up your displeasure and your discomfort. The medical evidence is the biggest mess that I've ever seen as an analyst and an investigator, and it just is a house of cards that has collapsed.